Hello and welcome again. I'm Jo Kakonga and this is another video from elttraining.com. This video is to help you with your Focus on the Learner assignment. I'll be going through what the assignment entails, what you need to include, and some of the common problems that people have with this assignment. So let's make a start. This is a good question to start with, I think. What is this assignment about? Well, it's what really teachers have to do all the time. So if you think about your learners, they come in many different varieties. They come different ages, different abilities, different levels, and they all have individual needs. So really what this assignment does is it allows you to take a particular learner and put them under the microscope a bit, and to do a needs analysis on them. So to look at the problems that they have and to suggest how you could help them with those problems. Now, just to note that there are no standardised assessments in CELTA, so each CELTA centre produces its own assignments and the rubrics therefore will be slightly different, but they are all based on criteria that are laid down by Cambridge, so they should be fairly similar. The assignment generally is in 3 parts. So part 1 is some background information about the learner. Part 2 is identifying some of the errors that they make. And part 3 is usually suggesting some kind of remedial action for the problems that you found in part 2. So what you're going to need to do for this assignment is to find a learner and to interview them. Now, a book that will be particularly helpful for this is Learner English. It doesn't cover all of the languages of the world, but it does cover a fair few. And this book gives an idea of the kind of problems that speakers of these particular languages will have when they're learning English due to L1 interference. So this is really helpful material. You should also make sure that you record the interview so that you can listen back to it afterwards and listen for the kind of problems that the learner has, and also get some writing from the learner. Just a paragraph is usually enough so that you can find out some mistakes that they make from that too. So let's go through this in order. Part 1 then, background information. Now, you might be asking what kind of background information is important. Now, this doesn't have to be very personal information. My learner has red hair and likes to walk in the woods. Not particularly important. So what kind of things are important? Things which impact on their language learning. For example, their first language is going to be hugely important. If you speak French, then it's much easier to learn English because a lot of the words are similar than if you speak Chinese, where there are no cognates at all, pretty much. So this is going to be quite a major influencing factor. Age is another factor which can have a bearing on your ability to learn languages. Now, clearly it's not the only factor, and whether young or old people learn languages better is quite a bone of contention. However, it's worth asking, when did they start learning? How old were they? And perhaps what kind of age are they now in terms of their language learning abilities? Previous language learning experiences are also going to be really important. If they've learnt other languages, if this is the 3rd or 4th language that they're learning, then clearly it's likely that they've got a good handle on how to learn languages and what it takes. So that might help. However, if that experience has been not very successful, then that might have quite a negative impact. How about with English? Have they learnt it before? Are they trying again for a 2nd or 3rd time perhaps? Have they not been successful in the past? These things will have a big effect, and also a big effect on motivation. Motivation is really key to language learning. So it's very important to ask, why are they learning English? What sort of reasons do they have for doing this? It may be for work, And again, this may be because their boss tells them they have to learn English, or it may be because they're on their own initiative want to improve so that they can get a better job. These things will impact motivation hugely, of course. It may be that they want to travel. It may be they have a particular exam to take. All of these factors will be important in terms of how successful perhaps they are. Study skills is another important thing. Their previous educational background will have some bearing probably on how they study now. So if they are well educated, probably they have better resources, better organisational skills, better study skills, and this may well help them to learn a language, although clearly it's not the only thing. Another thing that this may impact on is their literacy level. Now, do they have good literacy in their first language? They may or may not have. Do they have good literacy in the Roman alphabet or in another script? This will have a big bearing on spelling perhaps, and writing, and maybe reading too. And then of course there are other factors. Time, how much of that do they have to devote to this? Their family, work commitments, they may be very motivated but they simply can't fit it in. They may be juggling all sorts of other things trying to fit it in. So these kind of things will have a direct impact on their language learning, and therefore they're important. Part 2 then is identifying the kind of errors that they make. So as I said before, do record them when you do your interview with them. You can do this on most mobile phones and what have you these days. So do record what they say, because it's much easier to listen back to this afterwards. And then think about, what do you notice when you listen back to it? Their fluency. How well do they speak? How easy is it to understand them? Do they struggle for words? Are they umming and erring a lot, or are they quite fluent? Their pronunciation will be something to look at. The sounds, individual sounds, do they have problems with particular sounds? Now remember that for a lot of these it actually won't matter very much. What you're aiming for is comfortable intelligibility. You want to be able to understand them without trying too hard. They don't have to sound like the Queen. Word stress. This is another thing that can often cause misunderstandings. If a word is stressed wrongly, it often becomes almost unintelligible, so that might be an issue. Sentence stress and intonation. This can make a big difference to people's perception of somebody speaking a language. If your intonation is very flat like this, then perhaps you sound rather bored or boring, perhaps. So these kind of things are also important. These pronunciation issues obviously are usually caused by L1 interference, by things in your first language coming over into your second. Listening skills is something else to think about. So for example, how far do you need to grade your language for them to understand you? How well do they listen? How well do they listen to the TV, the radio? Do they find it difficult on the telephone? Clearly you're going to have to take their word for this, but it's worth asking. You know, do you need to have subtitles on the TV? Do you ever listen to the radio? How much do you understand? That sort of thing is useful information. Clearly these sort of things will be influenced by L1 again, by their level generally, and by the exposure they've had to English. So whether they've got a lot of exposure, where they listen a lot to the radio or songs, whether they live in an English speaking country, for example, these things will have a big influence. Something else to look at is the kind of problems they have with grammar. Now there are some common problems that are quite universal, I suppose. Articles, for example, at, the, tend to be very difficult for most learners, some more than others, some language groups more than others, but they're pretty difficult full stop. They're not present in many languages. For example, Slavic languages don't have articles. They don't carry much meaning. So that doesn't really make much difference whether they're there or not. That doesn't help. And there are lots of rules for these and many exceptions. So articles are often a big problem for people. Tenses. Clearly this is another major area where people can have difficulty. Past tenses are often a problem. Remembering irregular past tense and past participles. The present perfect is a bit of a minefield for most people, so that's a problem. These are sort of things you might look out for. Overusing will for the future rather than going to, or the present continuous, for example, which might sound more natural with personal plans. Omitting the S for the third person present simple, I go, he goes. That one's a very common problem, right up to advanced levels often. Omitting auxiliaries in continuous tenses, I going rather than I'm going or I am going. Auxiliaries in questions, what he go, where he go, rather than where does he go. So these kind of things are problematic for a large number of learners and are worth listening out for. Prepositions are another area of great difficulty for learners, particularly prepositions that are dependent on other adjectives or verbs. For example, she's not good at maths. This is a common problem, not to know which one's necessary. And prepositions of time, they're confusing too. In July, but on the 3rd of July, for example. Note that prepositions of location, it's on the table, it's under the table, aren't so difficult. It's more these dependent prepositions that are a problem, because although there are rules, there are many of them. Word order can be a real problem. Where do adverbs go, for example? That's often something which is mixed up. All of these sort of things can be caused, of course, by L1 interference. Learner English will help with this. It might just be the level. Maybe they haven't learnt the present perfect yet, or the past perfect, or conditionals, for example. They just haven't come across these yet, so they haven't learnt it yet. It might be that the mistake they made was just a slip, just a mistake. They do know how to use that bit of language. Perhaps they do know the past tense verbs, perhaps they usually get them right, but they just made a slip this time. So what those things actually are is sometimes a bit difficult to know. You're going to have to make an educated guess as to what you think it's likely this error is caused by. Vocabulary is also an area that it's important to look at. Do they have sufficient vocabulary? Are they struggling for the words? Is there a problem with L1 interference, with false friends perhaps? Inappropriate register, they sound rather formal. This often happens with Romance language speakers, French, Italian, Spanish, who use Latinate cognates when they sound rather formal in English. It's also worth asking the learner themselves, what do they think they need to work on? Because they'll tell you what sort of mistakes they often make as well. So when you've got a good amount of error and thought about why they might have made these errors, then part 3 is about suggesting some remedial action for that. So, just some things to think about. Is this remedial action for the whole class, or is it just one-to-one for this individual? Think about which problems you want to work on. You can't solve all of their problems immediately, so you need to prioritise. Think about the more important ones. Think about the ones which are more likely to cause misunderstandings, perhaps. So think about prioritising which problems that you want to work on. Think about the age and the level and the interests of the learner. So if you're thinking about material for a particular learner, then you want to aim it at something that's going to be not just useful for them, but also interesting and appropriate. And remember that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of great materials out there. Look on the internet, look in supplementary material books. There are lots and lots of great materials. You don't have to make this up yourself. You need to, in fact, it's important that you know where to look for certain materials. So do go and look for material that's already made that would be appropriate for your learners, for their problems. Some common problems that people have when they're doing this assignment are as follows. So part 1, people often get a bit too involved in the personal. They're talking about their learner and they're interested in them, but it's about aspects of the learner's life that relate to their potential to impact on language learning. So the fact that they have 3 children per se is not important, but it may impact on their language learning because it means they have no time to learn. So in that case it is important. So thinking about things that are important for their language learning. In part 2, some of the problems that people often have is that they don't identify sufficient numbers of error. Another problem is that the errors aren't identified specifically enough. For example, the learner has a problem with tenses. Yes, most learners have problems with tenses, but what specifically do they have a problem with? And try and exemplify. So take examples from the recording, from your written material. What have they had a problem with? You also need to state why you think the error may have been made. Now again, you can never know this for sure, but you can have an educated guess about whether it's, for example, L1 interference because that structure doesn't exist in their language, perhaps. In part 3, a couple of things that people sometimes have difficulty with is that they don't relate the material to the errors that are identified. So it may be that you've got a piece of material which may well be useful for your learner, but it doesn't specifically relate to the errors that you identified in part 2. Another problem might be that you just identified an activity that's at the wrong level for their learner. Perhaps it targets the language that you identified as being a problem, but it's too difficult or too easy for the learner that you've got. Another problem is that you just don't attach the material, so you need to attach the materials that you've found for that learner. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So good luck. I hope it all goes really well, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye bye.